So, Eric, you recently had one of your sons go off to college, and I don't know if it was that turn of events or other things that have had that become a topic in our household as well. And our daughter is going in a year and a half. And so we've been looking at colleges and starting to think about majors and all of that. And
Exciting.
it got me thinking about all of the known versus unknown costs of those college years plus whatever follows. I mean, we all, plan for wild success and amazing things for our kids, but what if they have a longer ramp to success and we as their parents need to help them out? And, did we really think about that when we were budgeting for our post-retire early years? And of course, that got the snowball rolling of all the other things that could come up in early retirement or traditional retirement that maybe we have or haven't budgeted for. And that's where the idea came from that I raised to you of, hey, why don't we talk about surprises that we may not plan for when we think about budgeting in retirement?
Yeah, it's funny. My mother-in-law has just retired, and she's facing RMDs, which they kick in after 72. And immediately I was like, well, is that much of a big deal? It's a big deal.
Oh, it can be a huge deal.
It can be a huge deal. And so, I think there's a lot around this. And for you, as someone who's stepped into retirement, you've reached financial independence, and now you have to kind of balance all of these expenses, right? The things on the expense side of the balance sheet without income coming in, a regular paycheck, right? So I'm also curious to know, like, what kind of surprises, what are the things that you maybe forgot to budget for? We've both developed a list here, lots of overlap in there. Where do you want to start on this?
Oof. I don't know. Should we start with a heavy hitter?
Sure.
I think one that is on everybody's mind, and maybe that's a good place to start because people clearly do a certain level of planning for it in the fire community or otherwise, and that's healthcare.
Yes.
And that starts with premiums, right? What do our premiums look like? Do we have ACA subsidies, and what do they look like? Of course, that gets us down the path of, well, what if that framework changes and there isn't subsidy? And so then I always start to wonder about, are people planning for that? I know my base plan was I get no subsidy. And of course, I think that's worst case perhaps, but none of us have a crystal ball on legislation. So that's one thing that I have on the top of my mind is, what does the cost of healthcare look like? But of course, it's not just about premiums, right? So something that is current for me is I've just signed up for my 2023 ACA plan.
Okay.
And I went back and looked at, well, should I stay on a bronze plan, which is what I was on? Should I consider a silver plan? Do that out-of-pocket analysis, because I'll tell you what, that is something that can be crazy lumpy year to year, and that's how much you spend out-of-pocket for deductibles and coinsurance.
Because the difference between, you've researched this a lot more than I have, and this kind of speaks to this whole question. The difference between a bronze plan and a silver plan is
it's really about how much are you expected to kick in as the plan subscriber versus the insurance provider.
Okay.
So things like well care, right? That's covered out of pocket. There's lots of things covered for children, et cetera, no matter what level plan you're on. But then when it comes to, I have to go to urgent care for an injury, or I need this blood test for, this purpose, all those things on a bronze plan, you're paying out of pocket until you reach your deductible.
Okay.
And so it does require knowing something about what your normal sort of state of health is for you and any dependents you have in your family. But then you have all that other stuff you can't plan for, right? I had a, skateboarding injury or, whatever. I stay off skateboards these days, to be fair.
Sack.
But you know what I mean? Yeah, hacky sack injury, absolutely. But so you have to make some assessment of that, and I feel like people probably do an okay job of that. But I don't know about you, but when I interact with the community, especially I think the younger people are, the more they sort of are biased as human beings as to base the future on our present.
Sure.
And you might be a very low cost healthcare consumer now, but fast forward 20 years or more, especially if you're an early retiree, you're not going to be on Medicare yet. You're going to have to think about what that out-of-pocket cost looks like.
Yeah, and I think of, even the health incidents that have happened in our family, like, care can be very expensive if you get a long-term illness, and medications, things that can be actually life-saving medications, can be astronomically expensive. And
Completely.
you don't think about those things. You don't plan for them necessarily when you're in your real healthy years, especially, I'm thinking about someone who's like, especially early in their journey, like, they're going to retire in their 30s, maybe. That it's hard to really think about and project out to those costs. I know you and I are a similar age, right? We're almost 50.
Yep.
We're getting to this age where we're having all of these diagnostic screenings, all the fun ones. And I think about those most immediately. Like, what would be the difference between like a bronze plan and a silver plan? I presume you compared some of those things. Like, what is there more of a shared cost if I go to a silver plan, because the price, the premium is going to be higher.
Yeah.
But for regular diagnostic procedures, is that something where I would see a benefit?
The biggest differences tend to be in whether a procedure on a silver plan would have a copay.
Yeah.
And then you would be covered for many things beyond that copay. Whereas on a bronze plan, you're responsible for the entire, insurance negotiated price out of pocket.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to do some math. And I mean, literally, I spreadsheeted this out in the beginning. Now,
of course you did.
It's a little simpler now because I know what I've had in the last couple of years. But in the beginning, it was, well, how often do we get blood tests, and how often do we have, non-well care appointments, or, need x-rays, or, all these things, because, in the beginning, it is kind of, finger to the wind on what is our consumption going to be like? And for us, it actually seemed very straightforward. It was, despite having this sort of run rate of procedures and prescriptions, we were still going to come out ahead on a bronze plan. But we had to accept the fact that if it was one of those years where, Jason ends up in the hospital and has surgery, which absolutely happened right after, in my first year post RE, that's coming out of pocket. And I'm going to max out my deductible that year. So yes, to your question, things like diagnostics and that, you need to look at that table of copays for like a silver plan versus what would that typical cost be out of pocket.
And if you're someone who's younger and retiring early, you may not have kids yet. That's just, if you think about the healthcare costs associated with that, and
totally,
I just had a teenager who was in an accident and spent, some time in the hospital. Thankfully, it wasn't bad, but I mean, those costs can add up really quickly, and
they really can.
It's not something you can really forego. I mean, of course, it's a personal choice, but man, this is an important one. And we have done episodes on healthcare in the past, and so we talk a lot about how you can model out these costs.
Yes,
and like you said, it is pretty personal to your own health history and family situation and what you project and see in the future. If you look down the road and see that your family has heart problems at a certain age, or some other event that may seem likely, then you have to pay extra special attention to this for sure. The other thing that I think is important to focus on is, we're used to, if you're working a W-2 job and you have an employer picking up the healthcare cost, you're not used to necessarily maybe looking at what the premiums might be. So it's quite expensive. It's probably going to be one of your largest costs in retirement. Is that right, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it your largest cost?
Is my healthcare premiums?
Yeah.
They're not, but only because of the rate of subsidy that I have. So the fact that we manage our income to the levels we do means that we're able to qualify for a decent level of subsidy. If I was going with my worst case, which is that I had zero subsidy, it would be my second biggest expense other than the full cost of, housing.
Yes. Yep. Because you still have a mortgage, right?
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. So man, that's a big cost. I saw a Reddit thread. Someone was contemplating retiring on $500,000, their total portfolio, and they were questioning the cost of healthcare. They're like, how do I figure out what this is? And people were just saying, well, you really have that's really not much room at all to make your plan work if you talk about 25 times expenses. And this was a young person, so worth a lot of focus. Anything else to cover on healthcare? Yeah,
maybe just one thing. And we have deep dived on healthcare in 2 separate episodes, so I would definitely refer people to those, and I'll put them in the show notes. But I think the one sentiment I do hear sometimes from especially younger people is that they think they're solving only for, and we're talking about the U.S. in this case, they're solving up to age 65 when they're eligible for Medicare. And I think it's just important for people to remember that, Part A is for hospital, Part B is for, other clinical work, outpatient stuff that you'd have, but that those don't 100% cover all expenses, and there are ways to get more coverage with, an Advantage plan or something. But, a number that I see touted often is that, you can expect like sort of 80% of your routine and preventative care to be covered. But if you start thinking about things like dental and vision and hearing, those are not covered by those parts of the plan. You can elect to go to Part C, Medicare Advantage, and things like that to get that coverage. Part D, of course, is for prescription drugs.
I was going to say that's a big one, right?
That can be a very big one to the point
huge.
You just raised.
Yeah.
And so what I would suggest people think about is at least look into that when you're starting to project your number and what your budget looks like, because it's not just about what you're spending today. It's about what you think you might spend in the future. And I'm not going to sit here, to be totally blunt, Eric, and say I have this thing solved. Honestly, my solution to this stuff is largely to just put some error bars on my healthcare spending. I have this subsidy, but my budget assumes I could spend a lot more. And I'm underspending versus my safe withdrawal rate. So for me, that helps me feel good. But to be perfectly candid, I have it spreadsheeted out what potential spending could look like year over year. I did add, kind of an increasing cost of healthcare in later years in the safe withdrawal rate toolbox, just like in the example Earn has in it. But I mean, that's a guess.
It's a guess.
So,
yeah. Yep.
But I think, I guess the way I feel good about it is at least thinking about it and putting some buffer in there, and just being cognizant of it is a good starting point. And I think as long as people are beginning to think about these things when they're projecting, that's kind of where I would leave it for healthcare, unless you've got something else.
Nope. It does raise kind of a larger question here, Jay, in that, I know you were someone who did a lot of heavy budgeting before you reached retirement. Now that you've reached retirement, what does the budget look like? Are you really tracking all of these different things? Because we have a number of different categories here. And I look at those and I say, I thought part of the goal of reaching financial independence was to be a little bit free of this, having to track every incoming and outgoing, expense.
All right. So let me explain where I'm at. And if anyone, and maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, but a few months back, I admitted that I had finally simplified my budget after, some useful prodding from you. I didn't quite have the micro level categories that I did before. I put it into much larger buckets, like, shopping. Yeah. And that's everything: food, clothing, whatever kind of. And then there's, the really fun stuff like, dining out or, spending money on activities. And then there's like a vacation bucket. So I had, much coarser budgeting happened. And then I would say the other thing I would add is I still have some sinking funds, but they're not for these giant ticket items. Some of these things we're going to talk about today, but they're for things like out-of-pocket healthcare spending, pet care, which is, could be swing wildly depending upon how the age of your pets and, the types of healthcare they need, and things like that.
And that's does that just sit in a high yield savings account or where?
It does. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yep. There's certainly things that are routinely spent, like, like pet care, for example, that is actually in, interest checking because I'm spending that from that monthly. But, on the flip side, there are people in the community who use much larger sinking funds for kind of, things like, I know I'm going to replace the roof someday. And so they put money towards it just to have that mental accounting for that spending, so they don't have this giant withdrawal one year. But my budgeting system actually doesn't account for that type of expense. So that's certainly something we can talk about the merit of or the potential challenge.
Yeah, I mean that suggests, home ownership was another category here on things like your roof, things like appliances, upgrades to your home. Those are probably real costs that you're going to face at one or multiple points within a 30, 40, 50 year retirement, right? So what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I would say I'm not so thoughtful as, Fritz, who we've talked to on the show before, where, every year he looks at what that home sinking fund, and I'm paraphrasing, I could get this wrong, looks like. And then, he adds to it annually, right. And he may add more or less depending upon what he spent or not. But like, I don't have a roof fund that I just keep putting into every year. My assumption, right or wrong, is that because I am, underspending
Yeah.
below my safe withdrawal rate ceiling, right? Let's say it says it's 4% CAPE adjusted, and actually it's over 4 right now, but I am, actually at around 3 CAPE adjusted. Well, I tell myself like, well, that's going to be okay because that one year I do have the lumpy spending. Well, I'll be good, but that's not really how the math works. So I guess I would say there's some risk in that approach, but I've decided that it's okay for things like that. I'm sure somebody will have a different take on it. Would love to hear from you, but yeah, I definitely am not explicitly allocating funds for big lumpy expenses.
Yeah, I would not be jazzed about doing that whatsoever. But here's my question about that. Would it make you more hesitant to do the work when it actually came time to do it? Like a roof is the kind of thing that doesn't usually just fail overnight.
That's right.
You have some sense for, when it's becoming a problem, when you're reaching the lifetime of the shingles or the metal or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So would it make you delay doing those repairs unnecessarily, or do you just see
think
that as a benefit? Because then you don't have to, cash in when the market is low or something. I mean, it's just.
I think you're asking the right question. I guess here's my answer. Let's see if you think it's satisfactory. Because I maintain about a 2-year cash buffer,
Yep.
I know that I could, fund immediately if needed expenses up to a certain level.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty decent number. And, my rebalancing process that I do twice annually are my normal opportunities to sell from the portfolio and refill that cash. So I guess what helps me sleep at night is that I have a mechanism to both get cash and then refill it. Might it mean that I have to refill more cash than I might like to on the odd year? Yes, absolutely. And I guess for the present, I've accepted that when I go in and do, minimal modeling that I've done on kind of taking out big withdrawals and then having to sell in a down market, it should be okay. And Lori and I just talked about this last week. She explicitly asked me, so what's that percentage that we're allowed to withdraw by the model, and where are we really? And that's a fair question, right?
Did you open up the spreadsheet?
I did not open the spreadsheet. We did this verbally. If I open the spreadsheet, I'm going to get stuff thrown at me. But I did comment that, we're this much below it, and it's pretty healthy. But the way I think about that is we have buffer built in that should something like this happen where we need to suddenly do major appliance replacements, or something tragic happens to the roof, we're covered.
Yeah, so I guess
should be okay.
For someone who's pre-fi, then as you're thinking about these expenses, which you don't want to forget about, you need to think about how to buffer if you're not going to be diligent about budgeting and creating sinking funds, create the buffer. And I guess, how do you ultimately create the buffer? Is it just an aggregation of all of these things? Because,
that's what I tell myself. Yeah,
some of this stuff is hard to plan for, right?
It is. And I think, as much as, you have me, kind of correctly characterized as someone who really explicitly budgets and plans for all this stuff, there's still a level of work that I'm not interested in doing.
Totally. That's me, man.
I'm just not. But what I have done is looked at the delta between what I'm actually withdrawing and what I could withdraw and said, well, does that amount, is that likely going to cover, most things, right? And the answer is yes. So I've told myself that's good enough. And so then I'll just go with that, because most years we won't have something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
I don't know if that's the right answer, but it's clearly.
Guess we'll find out in 5 years.
It mathematically has me convinced it's okay. I mean, let's put it back to you, right? You're thinking about this stuff too. You're not a budgeter. When you set your number that you and Laura have set, how did you account for big lumpy spendings? You're a homeowner.
I mean, just looking at what's going in and out now, I don't see it change. Like we spend on big ticket items now. And so we're just averaging it out over the years of, last 5-10 years of spending, and just say, this is roughly what we spend in a year. And like, it hasn't kept us so far from replacing things as we need them. We've upgraded the house, we've upgraded cars. So I'm looking at that as an aggregate whole, a real rough spending measure, and saying, this feels about right to me. But there are a few things in this list that maybe I haven't accounted for. Let's talk about a real hot topic right now, inflation. Right? I mean, how do you count? I mean, I know when we're talking about the 4% rule,
Yeah.
Sorry, I should say the 4% rule of thumb, right?
Yeah.
Since it's not a rule, but that is predicated on the idea of day one or year one portfolio withdrawal is
Yep.
4% and then increased year on year for inflation.
Yes.
Have you been doing that
Great question.
in your retirement? Because that's a big number, man,
Yeah,
right now.
in year 2, which is the first year, this calendar year, where we had this huge increase in inflation, I did not increase my number. And, we also have these, kind of 1 day a week fun jobs that we draw on a little bit for some money. But honestly, for next year, I am increasing.
Oh, okay.
It's still not exactly the percentage to maintain parity with inflation. But from my modeling so far, it looks like that should be sufficient to account for what I see as our increased spending, even if we both stop this, making this little bit of money that we do.
Yeah.
So that's what I've done. And the way I guess, I don't know if this is right or wrong, and I expect the math wizards to come in on this one, and that's great. It'll help me. But I think about inflation a couple different ways. Number one, what you just talked about. Am I increasing my withdrawals in concert with inflation, or is it somewhat below it? And so far, it's been below it. But second, it's when I think about returns over the long term, we know, and Bogle and many others have written on this over the years, that mathematically, the real returns after inflation are the same, irrespective of these wild swings in inflation we have. And that tracks over 200 years. So I get comfort that we're really talking about long-term math here, not short-term math. But that I don't mean to say that eliminates the real-time issues that you can have if suddenly things you're relying on, gas, groceries, et cetera, go up 10%, and in some categories double that.
Yeah.
It's something you have to think about.
And part of what you're saying is that you want to, for a long-term portfolio, stay invested in equities, which
100%,
is the thing.
And not 100% equity. Sorry,
Right,
that could be very confusing. But yes, you need to stay heavy in equities to whatever your allocation and comfort level is, because you need the engine to keep refilling.
I mean, part of the difference between you in your situation post-fi and mine pre-fi is, there's certain expenses that I have as a working citizen that you don't have. And, I like to try and keep those as minimal as possible. But, there's a certain amount of inflation that we're all subject to, right?
100%. Yeah.
You're not driving a gas car anymore, thank God. But I am. And as someone who goes to job sites and goes to, drives all over the place, and a family who's commuting for work and school and things like that, that's definitely an increased cost. If I heat my house with fossil fuels, that's an increased cost. You've moved to solar. That's a project that I think you did post-fi, right?
It is, but it's money I had budgeted pre-fi.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We knew that we will very likely do solar.
Yep.
So we had allocated some money just for that purpose.
Yep.
So yeah, we also don't have the expensive high cost meat in our house, which I know is something you have to deal with. I'm sorry, I know it's very important to you, but I've seen the reporting on the inflation impact on meat.
That is a fixed cost for us, man.
Let's get back to that discussion of elastic versus inelastic demand.
I mean, that could actually impact my healthcare costs in the future too. But
yes, it could.
We'll see.
Eric, if it's okay with you, I kind of want to go back to where I started this conversation. That's about your kids and maybe even other relatives that could be in need. This whole idea of college, and again, this is very much on my mind.
Yeah.
There are the known costs of tuition and housing and books and all those things that I think parents generally do a pretty good job of thinking about, whether they have 529s or not. We know what that stuff looks like, and we think about, in-school versus in-state versus out-of-state tuition, private versus public. But then I start thinking about, what happens next?
Yes.
What if your child is in a field that it could take a while to kind of really establish themselves in? What if they end up back at home? What if you end up with a child or a family member in severe need, right? Whether it's for medical reasons or something else, you may have additional expenses that could come up. And I think very few people probably explicitly plan on those because, most of us are optimistic and we assume that couldn't happen. But it could be a pretty big knock on your retirement budget.
Yeah. I mean, Laura and I have always said that our kids will always have a home with us. Yeah. And that may require some spending adjustments on our part. It's our expectation that as, people citizens of the world that they are going to go off on their own, and that
Absolutely.
they're not going to make a permanent place in our home, but they're certainly always welcome if they need to get back on their feet.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest here. I don't have a great way to account for this in my budget.
Yeah.
How have you
Well, I
accounted for
guess
it?
the way I think about it, and I don't think I've said this, in the minutes we've been talking already, but the way I think about it is, as long as you didn't set your budget up with like the thinnest of margins,
Yeah.
based on where you are today and where you see yourself going, you're going to be able to absorb more or less of this. And that's, I guess, where my conversations with people who are earlier on their journey, I do ask some pretty pointed questions sometimes. They'll show their budget today, have it very well characterized, honestly, better than we did in our 20s by a long shot, right? I didn't have any budgeting. And then they make some projections about the big ticket items like healthcare and whatever. And then they say, well, that's the budget. And by the way, I'm going to withdraw at 4%. And so, then there's a discussion to have about, safe withdrawal rate, et cetera, et cetera. But even then, I think the idea of putting margins of safety on, different categories and, putting some estimates in there that, they're going to get better over time. But I think it's as long as you're not having these razor thin margins of, well, I'm going to get out as soon as I can, as soon as I hit this number, and this number is predicated on these things, and it's really tight. I think that's where I start to get nervous.
Yeah.
So no, I'm not sitting here telling you I have explicitly planned, well, let's see, there's a 18% likelihood that my kid drops out of college and needs to live at home, and it's going to take him 18 months to find work, and I'm going to have to fund their grocery. Obviously nothing like that.
But it does raise this question of what is your responsibility as a parent to also raise a child who has some, awareness of financial independence and what it means to, be financially responsible to the family. Because,
yeah,
I feel like we have been heavy with our kids in forcing them to get jobs, not forcing them, but, like encouraging them.
Yeah.
To get,
You've strongly encouraged your kids to be independent, to get jobs, to be able to drive and get themselves to and from their jobs.
And that extends to getting scholarships and, so that's all part of being a member of our family, and we have that expectation. And I feel like that can also provide some kind of a buffer, that can help in these situations. Not everything has to be a financial buffer either. I mean, they can help out around the house. There's tasks that they can pick up that may have been expenses previously too. So I think there's lots of ways to solve this, but 100%. Having some awareness around it is a really good thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I think that's the right way to put it. And neither you or I want to sit here and rehash our 2-part episode on kids that we did last year. But, if you think about, let's be frank here. Neither you or I have sat down and done like deep dives on safe withdrawal rate with our kids. This is not what this is about. Nope. But I think the financial lessons and the expectations you set with your family, like you're setting, you're building a blueprint in there somewhere, and it's just an understanding about how the world works and how spending works and how you think about the value of money and time. And, every so often as they age, you get these little glimmers of realization that stuff sticks.
For sure.
I mean, I had this conversation just today with my daughter where she said, like, she was talking about, like, she likes to, her and her friends like to go to they like to go thrift shopping and like get their clothes there. And then they actually enhance them a lot. They do all kinds of sewing and stuff. And she was talking about saving her money to, whatever, spend on clothes. And I was like, we are willing to pay for your clothes. She's like, yeah, I'd rather like take care of it and go thrift shopping. She's like, and who would pay $25 for a pair of pants? Because that's ridiculous. I just loved the idea that she thought $25 for a pair of pants was outrageous.
That is cool. But these themes, like I think back to, times when I was a kid and like money themes, they ring hard. They hit heavy, I think about bringing homemade popcorn into the theater.
Sure.
Because, that wasn't really in the budget. And there's just like something we did, and I'm sure lots of other families did that too. And it also works in, as you're pointing out, in reverse. Like we can, give these positive messages about money to our kids that it doesn't always have to be negative. We can't afford that.
100%.
There are ways to do it. So yeah, I think I think we beat that one to death.
I think we did. What do you want to talk about?
Hey, I was going to ask you about, stepping in retirement, right? You got all this free time.
Oh, tons.
You got time to do whatever you want. No, I know. I'm kidding somewhat, but you've got
I
time to
know.
fill with all the things you didn't have time for
Yeah.
pre-fi, right? Like pickleball. I mean, the
I'm not
hiking?
playing
What
pickleball.
are we doing,
Hiking,
man?
yes. Hiking,
Lifestyle
yeah,
creep.
sure.
How do you account for
Lifestyle creep.
lifestyle creep?
Yeah, and I actually love this one because, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with somebody a few weeks ago online. They were talking about they're showing their high level budget and their leisure and entertainment budget was so low every month. And I was like, well, what's that about? They're like, well, for me, fun is just hanging out at home with the family. I'm like, yeah, but you also have a full-time job. And so like that's your weekend. And that's cool. You have little kids. It's great. I'm like, but interests change. Suddenly you're going to have all this time.
Yeah.
It's not just about vacations, or travel. Like, what else? Do you have hobbies? Are you going to start restoring cars? Like, have you thought about anything that's going to increase your spending? And they were like, no, I really haven't. And I'm like, well, it doesn't mean just because you're not employed anymore that you're going to go spend tons and tons of money, but you have hobbies and expenses, and you need to account for that somehow. And so for me, I think, I haven't, admittedly, again, explicitly allocated, well, here's my hobby budget, anything like that. I mean, Lori and I have a little bit of fun money every month. It's just for whatever we want to spend it on. But, we recently started backpacking again. And, let's face it, to have proper gear, even if you're buying stuff used, you're spending some money, especially if you want ultralight gear. And, that's not something we explicitly budgeted for. But again, it's the type of expense that comes up when you now have time to do those things you've been thinking about for years and you never got to. And so that stuff does come up from time to time. And again, it's another thing that makes me feel good about trying to keep our base level spending lower than it could be.
I think back to the episode where we talked to Steven about his budgeting.
Yeah.
He created he's got a FI number, and it's based on a pretty modest annual spend, and
It is.
he's given a lot of thought, but he's young, and I think, okay, he's in his kind of first or second job out of college, and I think, okay, well, what is it if I put myself back in that position and I fast forward to where I am today, and the expectations that I have for vacations, anything, hobbies, like you said, my level of comfort traveling, it's not what it used to. Like, I used to be able to sit in that back seat of that plane, but not anymore, man.
In the middle.
I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
fair.
that's the kind of thing that I feel like is hard to put hard numbers around, especially when you're younger, and you haven't even experienced that. And, to that same point, you and I are 49. What does that look like when we're in our late 50s, early 60s? Like, what things haven't we accounted for? And I don't know how to necessarily account for those, but I suppose when you get to that point, your hope is that the portfolio is growing in such a way that
support
you can start increasing the buffer even to maybe account for some of those things you didn't know you wanted.
Well, I think this is such a great point because, plenty of people in their 20s or even early 30s, they're like, I like to vacation on the cheap. I'm putting my money towards our investments because we want to get to FI by age 45 or 50 or whatever it is. We're inexpensive. We do car camping and lots of road trips, and that's great. But you don't know if at 50 you might not get into taking cruises. Obviously, a very high percentage of people do. It's not something we enjoy. But I'm not willing to say that we don't have a 180, and at age 60 that suddenly starts being a thing. Well, guess what? That stuff costs a lot of money.
Yeah. Or speaking to the kids thing, your kids are going to eventually grow up, and they're going to have significant others. And what if you decide you want to bring everyone on vacation? I mean, that's a real thing now. Like, that's a thing that Laura and I are thinking about for our kids as they both have significant others, and we want to go all travel together. I mean, those things, I don't think I would have thought about that necessarily like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But now that's coming into focus, and I don't know what other things are lurking out there that are like that, but it's kind of an interesting discussion.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there's all, there's the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns, right?
Right.
And I don't think either you or I are sitting here trying to say that people should have this grand architected plan that accounts for every possible contingency. But I think the reality is there's just a lot of stuff that can pop up,
Yep.
and they're nice things that you will want to do. And if you've leaned yourself down so much, you're going to have to take hard choices, I think. And at least for me and my wife, and it sounds like you and Laura,
Yeah.
you'd rather solve for a buffer that will allow for flexibility. And that, I guess that makes me feel good about controlling costs as much as we can now in reasonable ways, right? Still feels good. But
Or you take another job or side hustle or something like that. I mean, there's other
I
ways.
guess there's always possibilities.
There's ways to solve for it, right?
There
Hey,
are.
I was starting to think this year I got a big tax bill for my property tax. Totally unexpected. I mean, they
sorry
did a
about that.
revaluation in the town, and property taxes went up 40%. I was like, if I was on a fixed income, I'd be wow. I'd be squawking about that. Have you experienced anything like that? I know California treats property taxes much differently than the rest of the world.
Yeah, they do. No, I've had sort of incremental tax increases,
Yeah.
but nothing substantial, thankfully. But I mean, the bigger issue of taxes, I think, is a real one to plan for. And as I'm sure you're well aware, there are other things you need to consider.
I mean, yeah, like nobody can predict what future legislation is going to do to our tax rates, right?
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, that is where a lot of planning on, and I think the fire community is pretty good about talking about Roth conversions, and I mean, I think this brings up the bigger issue of where do your assets lie as you step into retirement, early retirement, right?
Yeah.
If they're primarily in tax deferred, 401ks or, 403bs,
Yep.
retirement plans that people typically have through work, those, the U.S. government's going to come knocking for their taxes at some point, right? And so this is where this whole idea of required minimum distributions comes in, which right now I think is at 72, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So once you get to 72, you're going to have to take a percentage of that full portfolio, and
Every year.
you're going to have to withdraw that. And if you don't actually do it, or you forget to do it, there's big penalties. So it's definitely a case where you need to plan how you're going to convert that money over into. Typically, people convert it into Roth IRAs, right?
That's right. And for many people, that's a path that makes sense. For us, we are, starting to do Roth conversions annually, but we also don't have these giant tax deferred accounts that so many people have, where it really is a planning opportunity. I think the guidance I would say is that no matter how early you are in your journey, it's worth looking into these topics that you and I are talking about here. Like, how does asset location affects taxes? For what kinds of people, at least with today's legislation, to be fair, your point is correct. For what kinds of people do Roth conversions make sense? And, when you think about your FIRE number, $1 in a Roth account is not the same as $1 in a tax deferred account like a 401k or an IRA. So it's worth thinking about. I think some people agonize about it, way on the one extreme. And I think that's not a good thing either. It doesn't feel good for anybody. So it's just be aware that taxes have a role to play. And if you don't think about them, you may find yourself in a very different tax bracket at 72 than you found yourself in at 71. So it's just planning is important, and you want to be taking steps and talking with, people like a CPA or something like that. If you have any questions that you're not able to get answered on your own.
And also, just the awareness of like even a taxable brokerage account, which I know that's kind of the lion's share of where your assets are right now, right, Jay?
Yeah, that's right.
So money that is earned through capital gains, long-term capital gains, is treated very differently than ordinary income, or interest income. It's different, right? So
that's right.
You have to be aware of those things and plan for it. And I agree. Once you add in this calculus of healthcare and how, earning money, earning income, making Roth conversions, creating taxable events can also affect how much you pay in a year for healthcare. it all gets pretty messy, right?
It does.
Pretty complex.
And, for many people in the fire community, they're planning on being the CEO and CFO
Right.
of their home, corporation. And that means it's on you to think about budgeting for expenses, the impact of taxes, all of these things. And it does seem like a lot. And honestly, it's a bunch of stuff. Very little of it is difficult, but there's so much interplay between these topics that it just warrants forethought and just diligence. And, let's be fair. This is why many people choose to pay for either, advice for financial planners, fee-only people. And on the other extreme, some people go the full assets under management route because this is not something that they're interested in doing. And as long as you've planned for those expenses, well, that might be good for you. But, there are a lot of things to consider.
Yeah. And when you're setting up your plan, I'm thinking about doing another one of those fee-only advisor consultations, like just to set the plan up. I'm like, okay, here's what I'm thinking for Roth conversions. Does this make sense?
Yeah, and I think we've joked on this show about spending $1's worth of energy for a dime's worth of impact, right. But flip that around. Paying $1's worth of fees or $1,000 worth of fees to an advice-only planner that could give you peace of mind and potentially save tens of thousands of dollars down the road. Well, that's a pretty easy case to make.
Give me the one thing you didn't account for in these first couple of years that you're like, oh, I probably should have put more in the budget for this, or has there been nothing?
I mean, so far there hasn't, but honestly, the leisure category is the one I think about the most because I like to think of all of our buffer, especially while we're younger, right? And I know people in their 20s do not think people almost 50 are younger, but let's face it, 50 is the new 40.
I feel young.
I like to think of being able to consume all that buffer in an annual period for leisure, and I love that idea. And but I find myself questioning myself sometimes, like, well, how well do I understand 5 years from now or 10 years from now, where I conceivably will still be quite well enough to travel a lot. And Lori and I love travel. Like, did we allocate enough? I have no idea. Where's the portfolio going to go? Yeah. And so that's where I do think about, like, do my buffers account well enough? And the bucket that I have for vacation, is it big enough?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah. I was hoping you would say that because
I have no idea.
It made me think of this one trip you took recently. I think you went to Germany and you were driving to the airport and you're like, hey, I parked at so-and-so's house. Saves me $300 a week. I was like, hey, dude, look at your portfolio. What is that as a percentage of your net worth?
Oh, look, that was a case where a friend was generous enough to offer to have me park at their house. I did not ask to park at their house.
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't. We could have them on the show and
You're
ask.
like, oh, hey, I'm in town to go to the airport. Just letting you know.
No. All I did was ask about, like, what's the current skinny on the best offsite airport parking?
Even worse.
That's all I asked.
Even worse.
Come on, that
it's
wasn't
a backhand
code.
ask.
Jerk. Anyway.
All right. I would have offered it up to you anyway, man. So.
Well, I appreciate that. Likewise.
If you ever need to fly out of Bangor, Maine.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite bus station airports in the country.
Hey, man. Longest runway in the on the East Coast.
I sometimes forget that.
I don't know if it actually is. It's just something. It's a fun fact I threw out there that somebody's going to hip check me on YouTube.
I don't know, Eric. When I thought about this topic, for me, it was just, can we raise awareness that we think about these core things, these core needs, must-haves, nice-to-haves, etc. when we do our budgeting, or most of us who do any kind of budgeting for retirement. And it's just, the more I think about it over time, there are just so many things that can fly in and suddenly incur expense. And you can't plan for all of them. Many of them, thankfully, will never impact the average person, but they could. And so the simple concept was, let's just get those out there, see what the community, how they comment, because surely they'll come up with, real experiences they've encountered. And if people can learn from those, I think that's a great thing.
Cool. Yeah. We'll keep going.
Keep on keeping on.